activist in Belfast, and she is now a minister in the government. On the way, she managed to get us to visit with an IRA hitman who was on the run. He'd escaped from British jail, so it was kind of, secret place and a lot of security and so on. I spent a couple hours talking to him, basically asking one question: what do you think you're achieving by killing Protestants? And his answer basically was, I'm not achieving anything. He killed my cousin, they killed my cousin, I'm going to kill their uncle, and then they'll kill my brother, and that's the way it is. Well, a couple of years later, he was on the negotiating team. Now he's in the government. Okay, things can change, and change for the better. And Mitchell had a substantial role in that. The real reason it happened is because the British finally recognized that if you want to deal with terror, and IRA terror was not a joke, you better pay some attention to its roots. The terror is, it's criminal, but it's based on grievances. And a lot of those grievances are legitimate, and they should be dealt with, terror or not. And if you do pay some attention to the grievances, you'll reduce the terror. And they finally agreed to respond to terror, not by more violence, but by paying attention to the grievances, and it worked. And there's been a tremendous improvement, and that's an important lesson of preventive diplomacy, if you like. Well, let's go back to the Middle East. So Obama introduced Mitchell, and he made a speech, and he said the United States wants to bring about peace through diplomacy and negotiations. And he said, fortunately, there's a very constructive proposal on the table from the Arab League, and he was referring to originally the Saudi proposal, which was adopted by the Arab League and then adopted by the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran. And the proposal calls for a two-state settlement on the international border, which has been the international consensus for 35 years. Blocked only by the United States and Israel, but that's something else we're not supposed to know. So they endorsed the international consensus, and they went beyond it in the Arab League proposal by saying, well, in the context of establishing a political settlement, establishing two states, the Arab states should proceed towards normalization of relations with Israel. Okay, so Obama referred to the proposal, said very constructive, pat them on the head, and then urged the Arab states to live up to it by beginning to normalize relations with Israel. Well, he's an intelligent man, he's literate, he knows that's not what the proposal was. The proposal called for normalization of relations in the context of a two-state settlement, kind of a corollary to it. So Obama mentioned only the corollary, omitting the content, which tells everyone who has a gray cell functioning that he intends to continue with the U.S. policy of extreme rejectionism, that is, blocking a political settlement, which the U.S. has in fact been doing ever since clearly ever since 1976, when it vetoed a Security Council resolution calling for a two-state settlement on full guarantees for the peace and security of every state in the region and so on, put forth by the major Arab states at the time. And continuing on, I won't run through the record, but it's been a very consistent record of leading the rejection front, of blocking diplomacy. And Obama was saying, okay, we're going to continue with that. Very clear. That's his one major speech on the Middle East. There was also quite an important speech by John Kerry, our senator, head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who's been one of Obama's active agents in negotiating in the region. Yeah, and Kerry had something. It was at the Brookings Institute a couple of months ago. Kerry gave the usual picture, the standard picture, virtual party line, exceptionalist. The United States is an honest broker, but that's true by definition, no matter what's going on. The U.S. is an honest broker, trying desperately to seek peace and human rights. And it's been sort of caught in this trying to get these two sides together. And Israel has been desperately seeking a legitimate partner for peace, and it's never had one. But Kerry went on to say, at last, Israel may have a legitimate partner for peace, namely the Palestinian Authority. And he then gave the reason. The reason was that during the attack on Gaza a year ago, which we call an Israeli attack, but that's a mistake. It was a U.S.-Israeli attack, joint attack. During the attack on Gaza, which is a violent, brutal, murderous attack, there were no protests in the West Bank. And the reason was that there's an army in the West Bank run by a U.S. general, General Keith Dayton, and that army was able to suppress any protests. Okay, so we've got enough military control over the population of the West Bank so that they can't even protest when the other half of Palestine is subjected to a vicious assault. So maybe at last Israel has a legitimate partner for peace. Dayton's army is trained with support of Israel and Jordan, and it's not the most violent army in the West Bank. The most violent of this Dayton's army is under State Department supervision, so there's some constraints on what it can do, kind of weak, but not non-existent. But the CIA is running its own military forces there, the General Intelligence and the Presidential Guard, and they have no constraints. What the CIA does is anything you like. Reports from there are that those are the worst state terrorist forces. So at last we have, Israel has a legitimate